We watched cities in protest over these videos, and I wanted to do something about it. Everyone had to be thinking, is this really the norm in America? And so I collected millions and millions of data points. For officer-involved shootings, we found no racial differences and no bias. And that's the part that people got really upset about. It was not only the media, but my own colleagues. The backlash was quite tremendous, but I will say, I'd do it again tomorrow. My father went to prison. People told me I wasn't going to amount to much. Imagine that we can use data and technology to fast track us to a world where everyone is operating at their God-given talents. That is a world that I am excited to enter.
CEO and co-founder.
Roland Fryer, the founding partner of
Palantir co-founder Roland Fryer.
Roland's one of the most interesting public intellectuals of our time. He's also an economist at Harvard. We don't hold that against him. Roland's someone who's curious about the world. He goes where the data takes him, and he's found some amazing results in education, in labor, and other areas like police use of force. He's a really courageous thinker, and he's building some important things. There's a big debate over DEI and meritocracy. Roland believes we can actually use data to solve a lot of these problems rather than just sit here and yell and talk about it. Let's actually figure out what the data says and let's apply that and make the world work better for everyone. Let's chat with Roland about it. I'm Joe Lonsdale. Welcome to American Optimist. Really excited to have Roland Fryer with us here today. Roland is a professor of economics at Harvard. Despite that, he's also one of the most creative and interesting minds around these days. Senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and also an entrepreneur these days. Roland, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Joe. This is going to be fun.
I'm excited to talk about your new company, Sigma Squared, in a little bit, but I want to start with your background for our audience, a little bit. You grew up, I think, in a really challenging situation, in a broken family. And, how'd you make it out?
I don't know how I made it out. I had a couple things maybe, Joe. I had a lot of people who took an interest in me. My grandmother was a school teacher and was, phenomenal. Even though she wasn't my parent, she liked to say she brought me home from the hospital, and she did. I had teachers along the way, but also, and I hope this doesn't sound too self-absorbed, but I was a big dreamer, man. I had things I wanted to accomplish in life, and there were people in the neighborhood I grew up in who were like, to show how tough you are, you should go to prison. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense to me, right? Like, why would I want to? I got customer service needs. Why would I want to do that? And so I really thought I was going to be good at something, and I was willing to put in the work to do it. And it started out as a little toy athlete, playing football at age 5 years old. But that gave me the confidence to know if you really put in the effort, you can be great at something. And so throughout life, when things came up, my father went to prison, et cetera, or people told me I wasn't going to amount to much, I just knew that probably because I was a dreamer, that big things were possible if I put in enough effort.
So, Roland, you went on to graduate magna cum laude from UT Arlington while you're working at McDonald's drive-thru, and you earned a PhD in economics from Penn State. By age 30, you'd become the youngest black tenured professor in Harvard's history. How's that possible? What led to that?
One tiny thing. When I was in college, I was working as an intern at Verizon then, but I did work McDonald's drive-thru, Pizza Hut too, all of them. And
All right.
I had the worst jobs America has to offer. The worst one was I was a waiter at Golden Corral, which is horrible. A waiter at a buffet, right? You make half a minimum wage and no tips. It was terrible. But I did knock out Employee of the Month. In any event, when I walked into my first economics course, literally Economics 101, it was taught by Ryan Amacher. He was the former president of the University of Texas at Arlington. And I tried sociology, I tried other things, nothing sang to me. They were all so complicated. My first sociology class, they said, the world is interlocking chains of oppression. And I was like, that's really complicated and depressing. I don't know how to think about that. Economics was people are self-interested and they maximize their own revenue. I said, now that makes a lot of sense to me. They maximize their own happiness. In any event, this professor had office hours at 7 a.m. The class was at 8 a.m. Now that I'm a professor, I know that was a joke, but as a student, I showed up every Monday and Wednesday and Friday at 7 a.m. to debate with this professor. We talked about government's role in the lives of poor people in America. We talked about um, optimal tax structures. We talked about optimal inequality
Hmm.
because, according to him, it wasn't zero. And having grown up where that was unheard of.
Yeah.
And I fell in love with economics, and so the, the way that I was lucky enough to accomplish what you described was because as soon as I went to that class, I was in a big hurry to catch up. That was my first economics class, and I then sped through undergrad and graduated in 2.5 years, and I did my PhD in three. So 5.5 years from, kind of hanging out in
Were
the
you in
old
a
neighborhood.
rush because it was expensive also, or what was the rush?
I was in a rush because I was enthralled by the actual subject matter, and I could see the power in it. I was a nerd, so they were paying full freight for me. I wasn't in a
Oh,
rush because,
amazing. There you go.
back in those days, Joe, I made, as a graduate student at Penn State, I made $15,000 a year,
Wow.
and I remember the first time I looked into a bank account and I had $3,000 in it, and I thought, what could happen to me? Like, I have $3,000. Like, there's nothing that could happen to me today that would cost this amount. This is pure profit. So no, I wasn't in a big hurry because I thought I was rich, $15,000 a year. But I was in a big hurry to use the tools of economics to actually increase social mobility. Because what I noticed was these tools were beautiful, but used for silly things. And the things that were most important for American optimism, like how do people get jobs that are equated with their skill level? How do you actually make true equal opportunity in America? Those things were led to politicians and other pundits to debate, and we weren't using the brilliant tools of economics to study those. And that's what I wanted to change. I was in a big hurry to change that.
You really did kind of run out of the cages when you got to Harvard, trying new things, exploring and studying that. One of my favorite studies you conducted, I think, with one of our mutual friends, is sponsoring it. Is you paid kids for better grades, right? You tested what works to get kids better grades. I think you spent like $10 million in the inner cities. What were the results you found?
Yeah, there were a few sets of results. You may be the only person who liked that. My grandmother didn't even talk to me when I was doing that. So, look, I didn't meet many adults that liked it, except for you, but I never met a kid that didn't. But the actual statistical results were very positive. When we paid kids so we did two types of experiments. One, we paid them for inputs, right? So we paid them do, to do specific behaviors or accomplish very specific things that we wanted them to do. Do your homework, come to school, don't beat people up, stuff like that. When we did that, it was wildly successful. So I was having a conversation yesterday with my old friend Michelle Rhee. We worked together in DC doing those experiments, and she was remarking, yes, they were wildly successful. On the other hand, when we designed experiments exactly as economic theory thought we should, which is you pay for the actual output, not the input,
Mm-hmm.
we got nothing. And so what we realized was that incentives can be extremely powerful. Um, and we even measured what the kids spent their money on. And so it was interesting. The kids actually saved, and it was really an interesting
Really?
experiment.
They'd actually
But
save the money.
it's a extremely high return investment in kids is to pay them to do specific behaviors like reading books and doing their homework.
One of the reasons I really liked it, other than the fact that it works, to me, you were showing something that people all need to see. Is this these kids in the inner city who were failing and suddenly succeeding? They weren't failing because they were dumb or because they were incapable. It was clear they weren't interested or didn't care or didn't think it mattered to get good grades. Right? I thought that was a
100%.
really interesting insight. Right?
The incentives weren't there for them, right? And it was interesting. An 11-year-old really schooled me one day in New York City, and I think it was in Crown Heights. And I asked him, why do you like the experiment? And he says, oh, I said, is it the money? He says, no, it's not about the money, man. He said, although it's nice. He said, in every other aspect of life, I'm basically need to be an adult. But when I come to school, I'm not treated like one. And so for him, the incentives, this really was his job. Now he could focus on it. And I never had, I mean, sometimes you do the right thing for the wrong, for lucky reasons. And I never thought of that as a mechanism, but these kids really liked the idea of making this what they were truly focused on in their occupation. We do that in middle class and upper middle class households all the time,
Yeah.
but in the inner cities, not so much. And so I think that was one of the reasons it worked well.
I love it. I grew up with my dad paying me for good grades, so so to me it's all intuitive.
That's
But
weird. I grew up with my grandmother whipping me for bad ones. So that was We can't do that in schools, though.
No,
I
well,
tried.
we used to do that. I want to ask on the topic of education, because you've done all these studies and found lots of cool things. Is there anything else that strikes you as like a really cool insight that you could share that's one of your favorites, from all the education stuff you've done?
Oh man, I think my favorite work in education is the work we did in Houston. I think and there's two basic insights there. One, for the first half of the work I did in education, Joe, I was really focused on IRR, which is really important, and did this work or not? I wasn't really focused on, is this something that can fundamentally close the gaps in American education, right? Because incentives are great, but let's say the gap between poor and rich is one standard deviation. Incentives will give you, a quarter of that, but you got three quarters left over.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we did that I'm really proud of is we went around to uh, charter schools, some successful and some not, and we used their flexibility and their natural variation in their policies and what they do with kids and their pedagogy, et cetera, to extract from that five things that explain 50% of the variance in what makes some charter schools good and other charter schools not so good.
Hmm.
And we didn't stop there. We took those five things and we put them in a randomized experiment in Houston in the worst 20 schools there. And what we showed was that in 3 years in the secondary schools, you could close the racial achievement gap in math, and in 5 to 7 years, you could close it in reading. And so this is something where we distilled down the best practices from the innovation that's happened in charter schools and then put them in regular old public schools without a lottery, with no parent consent, and demonstrated that you can actually turn these schools around and fundamentally change the lives of kids. So it just showed me that what's possible in American education if we have the courage to do it.
That's amazing. Where can people read about that if they want to go read about it?
Yeah, hopefully we'll link to my some papers on my Harvard website, and it's there.
Perfect.
It's called Injecting Charter School Best Practices into Traditional Public Schools.
That's amazing. Well, we'll definitely link to that. I want to go over one more area of study of yours that was even maybe more controversial, if that's possible, after the education work you do, which I love. The most noteworthy probably was your study on police use of force, right? And this was in 2016, shortly after the shooting of Michael Brown. I apologize, you've probably told the story a lot of times, but can you reprise it briefly for us? What did you discover about the police use of force, and why did it piss people off?
Yeah. Well, look, I was upset because I was watching, just like you and everybody else, these videos come out, and we were watching this, and everyone had to be thinking, is this really the norm in America? And we watched cities in protest over these videos, and I wanted to do something about it. Now, as you know, I'm an economist, and I believe in comparative advantage. So protesting is not my comparative advantage, but I'm a data nerd. So I decided, let me go collect some data, and I will demonstrate that police are biased, and then that'll help this movement along. And so I collected millions and millions of data points, both on the lower level uses of force, putting your hands on a suspect, throwing them up against a car, maybe hitting them with a baton, and other physical types of force that are not lethal. And then we also collected a lot of data on actual lethal uses of force, officer-involved shootings, for example. And what we found was that on the lower level uses of force, there are racial differences that we couldn't explain. And we put them through formal bias tests, and there is bias that goes on in the lower level uses of force. What we didn't find was that bias actually was still there as the force ratcheted up. So for officer-involved shootings, we found no racial differences and no bias. And that's the part that people got really upset about. I didn't expect them to get that upset about it. But it was not only the media, but my own colleagues. And, but we put the paper out, and the backlash was quite tremendous. But I will say I'd do it again tomorrow.
Well, it's definitely courageous. I know you had people even inside of Harvard who went after you, caused you a lot of trouble, disinvited you from some things all around this. And I think one of the ones who went after you, she ended up being the president and then got thrown out. So that must have been interesting to watch after all of that.
That happened? I didn't even notice.
Didn't even notice. Let's go to the DEI debate. We'll skip some of that. That's good. As a transition to Sigma Squared, I want to ask you, about a 1995 study on the difference between black and white wages in the workplace. Can you explain the study and how it impacted you and your work on these issues?
I grew up in a lot with my grandmother, and my grandmother was, I think this is important. I'm sorry, it's a roundabout way, but my grandmother was born in 1925,
Mm-hmm.
and she integrated Florida public schools in 1969. And her first day of integration, Joe, she was spit on, and I only say that because she had very different views of race relations than I did. Thank God that the country was in a different space when I was a kid, so that I
Yeah.
had a different purview. And so that's one of the things we would argue about a lot. But I will admit, I was inculcated into the view, or that's how I was raised, that discrimination was omnipresent, and it was you could look someone in the face and understand if they were biased or not. Although we didn't use words like bias back then.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I got to graduate school and started thinking about what to work on, I was really interested in testing some of my grandmother's theories, those things that I'd sat on the couch and sipped sweet tea with her for years. I was interested in that. And one of them was the prevalence of discrimination in the labor market. And I stumbled on a paper in 1995 written by William Johnson at the University of Virginia and Derek Neal at the University of Chicago. And what they wrote was that what they found was that once you accounted for pre-market skills, that the racial gaps went from something that looked like 33%. So before this paper, what
Mhm.
people did was they ran a bunch of regressions without great controls,
Yep.
meaning they weren't accounting for context in the right way. And the result was a 33% difference in wages between blacks and whites. That's a huge amount. Okay? So for every dollar a white person makes, a black person makes 67%, even when they're equally qualified. But the issue is it's hard to understand if someone's equally qualified.
Yeah.
And so what Neal and Johnson, they had a brilliant idea. The idea was, what if we accounted for and only compared people who went into companies with the same skill set, right? And so that skill set was obtained before they went to the company. So it's really apples and apples at the time of hiring.
Yeah.
That's oversimplifying, but that's basically it. And what they found out was that 33% went down to 7%.
Wow.
Okay? And in other words, they would say, if you're really interested in racial inequality in America, you've got two options. You've got two margins, economists would say, to think about. The developmental margin, which is, should we spend resources on K-12 education, making sure people obtain skills? Or on the employment margin, should we spend our energies on regulation and making sure that employment practices are unbiased? Okay. Well, their results would say, look, if 80% of the effect is happening before people ever hit the market, that means we need to spend more time in K through 12 education. And it's because of that paper that I spent so much time in education reform, trying to ensure that people get to the labor market with the same skills, and less of my time, although I spend considerable of it, figuring out innovative ways to ensure that we don't have bias in companies. So the paper is really, really important because it says two things. And typically in America, people say one or the other. The two things this paper says, just to repeat, is yes, there is bias in the world, but the vast majority of disparities is accounted for because of K through 12 skills.
This is more Department of Education were it run correctly than the Department of Labor, basically. Like we need
That's
more
exactly
more
it.
training and less going and harassing people.
Right. And both of them are statistically, important, but one is a lot more important than the other.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I want to ask you, one of the things that really has been bothering me lately, Roland, we're trying to study how to make government better. You probably see there's a huge election going on in the background. There's debates about all these things. And, my friend Elon has gotten really passionate about making government, less broken and wasteful, amongst others. And one of the things I studied, there used to be tests in the government starting in 1883 for almost 100 years. We had these tests that are merit-based. And the idea was you can only run certain departments if you can get certain scores, right? And so I think there's a 100-point test called the PACE exam in the 1970s. And it turns out you need about a 90 score at least to run something really senior. And as of the late 70s, there's about a single-digit percent of people who got that really high score. But unfortunately, it was only 0.6% of the black applicants that got that score. And so the courts, they got rid of these tests because they said that's disparate impact. I'm curious how to think about that and disparate impact in general, because it seems like this disparate impact thing has stopped us from having a lot of these merit-based tests in general. So to a lot of us, government just got stupid over the last 40 years because you can't even quiz people anymore. And yet people seem to be still obsessed with disparate impact. Like, are they correct? Like, why is that?
Yeah, it's not how I would think about it. I would say, look, it's not whether or not there's a disparity in the test scores that should cause you to throw out the test. Although they've been doing this, as you say, forever. They continue to do it. I remember years ago that on the SAT, they threw out the following test because it was biased. 7 is an integer. Could you pick out the other integers? And they threw that out because it had disparate impact against non-minorities. So it's just a culling of test scores to make us all look like to blunt the instrument. Here's what I would do. I would say, look, is the test equally predictive for the groups?
Yeah.
That's what matters. And if not, then maybe you want to use different instruments for the different groups, right? I know that's controversial, but the idea is what you're trying to do in the most earnest way is figure out what predicts success, right? That's what these instruments are for.
That's a great
And so
point.
if you told me that, look, there were really, really skilled Black people who scored very low on this test in aggregate at scale, not 2 people, but on average that was true, that it was essentially zero correlation between the test and a objective measure of productivity for Black people, but for white people it was different, then I would say, well, this test is not a good test. Let's find another instrument that's correlated for both groups. But that's really important. I get really nervous, Joe, when people say, when the first thing, when a thermometer tells you you're cold and your first action is to throw out the thermometer.
Yeah.
What we need to understand is whether or not it's actually accurate.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And there were some efforts at the time that some of these tests did seem to be predictive, but that's a great point. You need to really confirm, are they predictive for each of the different racial categories as well, because it might be different depending on the culture you came from. And that kind of takes us into sigma squared a little bit, because that's something that's kind of tied to what you're trying to do now. You're trying to predict how people will do in their job performance. So we have a lot of people, especially big corporations, talking about doing DEI, talking about doing diversity. But what they really care about with hiring, with promotions, is how people are actually going to do on the job, how they're going to perform, what kind of value they're going to create, right? So how have you approached this?
In the simplest but pretty data driven way, what we're trying to do is supercharge meritocracy, right? Because at a high level, and I'll get into the details if you want, but at a high level, right? If companies have bias, then meritocracy is completely consistent with a DEI strategy. Because if you're getting to your talent frontier and you have bias, you're removing that bias and you're saying, look, I'm just going to hire the best person for the job. Then you're getting higher productivity and not diversity.
That's ironic. So if you assume the company actually is like super racist, then the DEI would be working better.
That's the point, right? Yeah. Then you don't have to call it DEI. You can just say, hey, I'm trying to ensure meritocracy in my hiring.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's what we're working with large corporations to do, is to supercharge that meritocracy. And the way we're doing it is understanding for each company their specific success phenotype. Right. And, you know this better than anybody, but I don't care what industry you're in, whether you're at Harley Davidson or you are an AI company or some other type of analytics company. You are in the people business. Right. And so what we're doing is we are helping companies predict who will be successful before they ever start in a really data-driven way, right? And so we are understanding the types of folks who have been successful in the past, by role, by region, all sorts of things like that. And then when people apply, we're able to give them a screener score immediately, instantly, to say, hey, this guy Joe applied, and here's what we think his expected tenure is in the company and his expected performance.
How are you getting this data? Your data-defined success traits, right? Like where are these coming from? What's predictive?
Well, they're coming a lot from the HR. They're hidden in plain sight in the HRS systems that are already in use every day in these companies, and they're just not making use of them in this kind of data-driven way. I think that's the first step. The first step is we help companies optimally use the data they already have. But the second step is even more exciting, which is we're working with companies who are really trying to get innovative and even doing a lot of A/B testing on finding the types of questions that are predictive of the folks that they want. So some people are looking at, softer skills like grit and resilience and locus of control. Do you internalize things when they go wrong, or do you blame other people? folks are looking at all sorts of different characteristics and traits that they can assess at the time of hiring, and then we are helping them A/B test those things so we can get an application and a set of interview questions that are the most predictive of high performance. Let's go back to your previous example and say, look, Roland, we had this test, disparate, all that. This process would help you figure out the types of questions and instruments that are most predictive for you specifically as a company. And they'll be different. They'll be different for Starbucks than they are for Pizza Hut. But the key thing is you can build these, we help companies build these models internally, which turns out to be their own specific talent IP. And then they can operationalize that to make sure they get the best people and the best jobs doing the things that they're capable of doing. And that is when you get people to their talent frontiers.
No, it makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about hiring and compensation as well, because that's tied into this. One interesting data point you discovered I thought was kind of crazy is that high performing Black employees are often even more likely to be promoted than similarly performing whites, but among those with mediocre performance, the whites tend to have an advantage in promotion. And I know not everything should be about Black versus white, but this was just very interesting to me. That it's like if you're a really smart Black guy, maybe like you got an advantage in the world, but if you're like amongst the mediocre, you have a huge disadvantage. That's kind of fascinating, right?
It's kind of interesting. It is. We have seen it a lot in large enterprise data, but it's even true if you look at the census data. So if I were to show you, hey, what are Black-white gaps look like at different percentiles of the distribution? If you're at the 90th percentile, there's been a lot of convergence between Blacks and whites in the last 30 or 40 years, right?
Yeah.
But if you're at the median, there's been the Black-white wage gap at the median is the same today as it was in 1950.
Wow. So I can see why people at the median would be experiencing a world that's very different than the people at the high end.
Yes.
Because in my life,
Yeah.
I work with a lot of like super smart African-American people. And if anything, everyone's even more trying to hire them, right? Because that's like the world I'm in. I can see why there'd be a political difference maybe for the median then. They're pretty annoyed. They're living in a different world.
Well, it's funny because we were working with a very large restaurant chain, and I was trying to convince them. I think their talent, pipelines are a little broken, and they're not hiring, talented people. This is no role, and we got all these great programs, et cetera. So I applied, couldn't get an interview. so yes, but there is an anecdote, which is I still can't get a job at.
You still got to work at the buffet, man.
Stuck at the buffet, bro.
That's rough. It's interesting. How politicized is this in the big companies? Because a lot of us from the outside, when we see DEI, we think like, I'll share this obnoxious thing on X where like the government's going for 4 days to party in Florida with Secret Service right now for their DEI LGBTQ thing when it's, busy time and all this. To a lot of us, it's like this, like they're just spending money to party and it's politicized and it's silly. And like, how many of them really want meritocracy versus want something else? How should we think about that?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer, but I in my experience, executives really want meritocracy. They don't know how to say it in the right way, and they're trying to figure out it's more of a comms problem than it is a substance problem.
Yep.
Right. And they also don't have the tools to do it, right? Because most HR analytics tools are, let me connect to your systems and show you, dumb dashboards. Sorry, we're gonna get some complaints about that, but whatever. To show you, here's how many people you hired last year. Here's how many people here's the average wages or compensation. Maybe, but what I think where the future is helping CEOs and COOs and CHROs really optimize talent in a serious way by using their own data, right? And not in a statistical snapshot way, but in a sophisticated ML AI type way. And that's that's the software we build to make that easy for them, right? Because that's you can put that on autopilot, and it can really supercharge the analytical capabilities that companies have now. And I think if CEOs understood what was possible in terms of supercharging meritocracy, I've never met one who said, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't want the best talent.
Well, this does seem like a very good 2024 correction to go back to meritocracy. I think everyone wants, not everyone, but I think the majority of our society wants to help people who are either underprivileged or make sure they're not discriminated against. But it seems like a lot of things went away from that. You're seeing a movement in tech and a lot of these companies to now embrace merit again and use that to help everyone. I want to ask, what are some of the results to date? Like, what are some of the examples? Who are you working with? What can you tell us?
Well, I don't know if I can name names here, but I think
Yeah.
that
Tell us
you
about some
know,
wins.
we are working with uh, corporations that range from in size from 230 employees to 700,000 global franchises, and it's all the same type of problem, which is particularly in food and bev or in hospitality or other entry level jobs. It's all about figuring out how to reduce attrition by hiring the right people, right? And most of the products out there, Joe, are all about saying, let's just hire faster. And less friction in hiring is always a good thing. But what if we could hire faster and with higher predictive quality? And that's what we're helping companies do. So it's we're I like nothing more than helping innovative CEOs win,
Mm-hmm.
right?
That's
And the
fun.
way you win is that you get the right people in the door. And this is not early 2000 1990s HR I'm talking about. This is using the most sophisticated analytics on the planet to be able to finally break through in an area that I think has been a real pain point for a lot of executives, which is how do I use data in a serious and sophisticated way to increase the talent available to me to reach my goals.
The talent wars have definitely gotten a lot more intense, even in the last 10 or
100%.
10 years or so.
100%.
On the food and beverage you mentioned, I know you're growing really fast in that area. Why is it useful, in particular for food and beverage? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, it's as we joked at the beginning. I did have all these jobs early in life, and that is fundamentally a people business. And I talked to a food and bev CEO last week who described to me uh, year over year attrition in the 40 to 50% range. Right? If we can use analytics to get that to 25 and 30, that's a game changer for his business, right?
Mm-hmm.
And or one of the key hiring points um, for franchisees is um, how do I get the best store manager? How do I develop a talent pipeline from entry level to store manager so I don't have to go outside for that? These are all challenges we're helping people in food and bev actually solve. And so attrition is really a big problem in the food and bev industry. And what we're seeing in our algorithms is that we can really significantly reduce attrition by understanding and helping serve up really high quality people in the interview, right? Like you take big chains, some of them don't even interview 90% of the people who apply,
Hmm.
right? And so we're helping them with things like an AI interviewer to surface up talent that they might have overlooked before. But the key to our success is using a company's own data to help to and the software tools so that they can build models that the software tools do it for them, so that when someone applies, right, imagine you open up your applicant tracking system and you don't just get a name and an address, but you get an expected tenure, an expected productivity. So when you're looking to hire someone, the computers have already told you, here's how successful we think Joe will be.
To dive one level deeper into the data science there, like when you have like an expected tenure, like what's the standard deviation you're getting there? Pretty good models, and then also like what is it pulling out? What's it finding is useful for these things that you think they wouldn't use
Yeah.
otherwise? Is there any example of that?
Yeah. Um, things like um, uh, experience, education really matter, but might matter in different quantities than you might imagine. And the standard error on these estimates for big companies is extremely small, right? We can make really, really fine delineations. Now, if you're a company of 40, of course our standard errors are going to be higher. But for larger franchisees, right, you have 200 300 employees or medium size, we're making really, really precise estimates on the expected tenure and the expected performance of these people. And again, it doesn't overwrite the humans. I want to be very clear about that. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
overwrite the humans, But if you're only going to interview 2 or 3% of the people who apply, let us serve up to you who we think those top 2 or 3% actually are.
Is there any way to give like really short tests or certain types of questions that help you with the cohort analysis or help you learn more? Because people might BS their resume. Like, how do you?
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that goes into the phase two, right? Phase one I described earlier is we take the data you already have and build models. Where it gets really fun is what you just described. When, if you were operating a franchise, you and I, Joe, would come in and say, all right, like, what should we ask at the time of hire? What can we experiment with that's going to have the highest predictability? Could be a short test, as you described. Um, it could be that we ask, um, all sorts of other types of open-ended questions and allow people and allow AI to actually analyze the answers. Really, and that's where the fine tuning of the models to particular companies becomes a lot of fun. That's how you help people win, is because the executives have real hypotheses about the types of uh, characteristics and traits that are really successful for them. What I'm trying to get away from is these kind of corporate terms like, I want, uh, radical teammates. Like, what does that mean, right? I want the data to tell us here are the specific characteristics and traits that we had access to that are correlated with performance, and let's go double down on those things.
I love it, and you're gonna learn over time and get better. I love the visual of you and I doing a food service business together. We gotta figure out what kind of branded
Let's do
stuff we're
coffee,
gonna
man.
sell.
$6 for flavored water. I mean, I'm all in.
Let's do it. Roland, we started American Optimist to push back on a lot of the negativity and cynicism in our country. You're somebody who makes me really optimistic. What do you hope to achieve with Sigma Squared, and how could things look better and different if people, have the right perspectives on the issues of bias and race and these sorts of things?
Imagine that we can use data and technology to fast track us to a world where um, everyone is operating at their God-given talents, right? Or everybody, or we're at a state of meritocracy, right? I know for some people that's like, they'd rather go with Elon Musk to the moon, but trust me, uh, this is both harder and more satisfying. Sorry, Elon. It is a world in which the best person for the job gets the job, and people are going to look at me like I'm naive, and I'm not. Okay, that's data can help us get to that place uh, many years before our intuition will ever get there. And that's what I'm really excited about, because that's something, talk about American optimism, that's something we can all get behind. Who doesn't want the best person in the job? Now, we may argue about the true definition of meritocracy. No, let's do that over a beer sometime. But the idea that we have gotten rid of any type of bias and friction in the hiring and promotion processes, and we are limiting, you know, the human bias in that system and allowing data to drive us, not all the way, but drive us. That is a world that I am excited to enter. That is a world that gets a guy like me an interview at the local food place. That's a guy who, and you asked me at the beginning, how'd you do it? It's because, growing up in Texas, I had the view that, and people operated in the way that if they thought you really had the skills, they'd give you an opportunity. And I want to use technology and software to be able to supercharge that for every company. I want everyone, independent of where they grow up or how much money their mom or dad has, to be recognized by these algorithms and understand this person has true potential. We've seen this before, right? The machines are way better at pattern recognition than human beings are. And be able to say, we've seen this before. We think this person has potential. At least give them an interview, give them a shot. That is true equal opportunity. That is not wait until the end result and saying, let's figure out the numbers so we look good to the public. That is changing the process so that we can supercharge meritocracy. And I believe we're on the path to do that. And that's why the stuff we're doing at Sigma Squared is so absolutely exciting. Because if you imagine a world where that's true, then we're not having these debates about DEI and this and that and this. We are saying, look, we're hiring the best people for the jobs, and here's the evidence that we're doing it.
I love it. Well, Roland, there's nothing more American than using your research and using entrepreneurship to help people self-actualize and lifting up millions of lives. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.